When this park opened in 1972, this guy, and his name is Jesse Diaz, he went down there with a bunch of his buddies, and they were looking at these dinosaur footprints. But he said real close to that, there was another sign that said caveman tracks. And he just like started putting his hands in it, and he had never seen or even thought of that people could be that big. But fast forward about 12 years, he said, and he was reading through Genesis, and he got to chapter 6, and he read that there were giants on the earth in those days. And he said it was almost like something, just like a picture came across his mind. He just remembered putting his hands in these massive tracks. And he told his wife, he's like, we've got to go down to the state park. I've seen these tracks before. And he drives down there. And they go down, he's all excited. They get down there, he cannot find the tracks anywhere. He looks and looks. So finally, he's probably a little bit irritated at this point because he's going to go show his wife these tracks that he remembered. He goes to the ranger station. He goes in there and he's like, what happened to the caveman tracks that y'all used to have down here? And they just looked at him. They didn't say anything. He said, what happened to the human caveman tracks that y'all used to have? And someone spoke up and said, we never had anything like that here. He said, oh, yes, you did. Back in 1972, I saw them with my buddies, and they saw them too. And the guy's like, no, we never had anything like that here.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures. We are checking in on a good friend of ours, Travis, today. Giants of Ancient America. He was on episode 5. And let's just talk about Texas for a second here, Luke. We got our good buddies, Dr. Jed Burton down in Texas. We had stories of Rockwall, Texas. Travis is down in Texas, kind of in the Dallas area, Fort Worth area. And I texted him the other day and said, hey, found this old book from the 70s called Valley of the Giants. You're never going to guess. You got giant man tracks in your backyard, buddy. For those of you who've been with the podcast since the beginning, you know that Travis collects, all these newspaper articles about giants. He's got over 1,000 now, and being discovered here in North America, and all kinds of weird tales that go along with what happens when a farmer or somebody pulls up a giant skeleton, where it goes and goes missing. We've made fun of it. We've immortalized it on T-shirts. Smithsonian has the bones. Yeah, Texas.
Yeah, it's amazing, and they're in the midst of a pretty severe drought the last 2 years. So things have hit the media about how, with riverbeds drying up, that some of these dinosaur tracks specifically are becoming exposed. They're usually underwater, right? So these, of course, are fossilized into the stone, into the strata. And what's amazing about this book, Nate, is pre-state park, and it's about a guy that went out, doctor who went out and documented these giant humanoid footprints that were alongside in the same stone, same strata as the dinosaur footprints. And there's a bit of mystery and intrigue around these because they seem to have disappeared. But this book has got a ton of amazing photographs and evidence from 1971 on of this guy's journey of documenting, measuring, photographing giant humanoid footprints in stone next to the dinosaur footprints that are now in Dinosaur Valley State Park.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of see what it was like to be Blurry in 1971. Go back, kind of read some of this book. We're going to get into the history. I forgot to mention Joe Taylor. The late Joe Taylor was on the show many times. He was down in Texas. He was also a great member of the Blurry community trying to push this narrative forward that giants existed. He had his own museum. And I love these guys down in Texas, man. It's just, there's a lot of history there. And there's just a lot of guys down there that are just looking for the truth and trying to push it forward. So thanks for listening to this podcast. If you want to become a member, blurrycreatures.com/members. Support the show. Thank you guys for helping us do this and keeping the blurry content flowing. All right, let's get Travis on the show.
All right. Nate, the book that you got is called The Valley of the Giants, written by Dr. Cecil Dougherty, who's a chiropractor. He's a DC. This actually had 4 editions, 1971, 1973, 1974, and 1976. It's copywritten in 1971. So this is a real book, printed by the Bennett Printing Company in Claiborne, Texas. And of course, Dr. Dougherty was out of Glen Rose, as we talked about. But I think the intro is very interesting as he tells the story. And The Valley of Giants is what it's called, Chapter 1. 7 years ago, when I first moved to Glen Rose, Texas, I began hearing tall tales about the giant tracks, the giant animals called dinosaurs. I also heard tales like way back when I was a boy, I saw these giant men tracks in the bedrock of the Paluxy River. And I would ask, how large are these men tracks? The old timers would measure off about 18 to 24 inches with their hands. Then would ask, where are those tracks? I want to see them. And the best answer I could get was, up the river a ways. This was so indefinite that I began spending my day off walking along the Paluxy River up from Glen Rose, Texas, to try to discover these tracks of which I had heard vaguely. For 2 years, I photographed the dinosaur tracks, the brontosaurus tracks, and the trachodon tracks, but I was never able to locate these giant man tracks. One day while searching in what is now Dinosaur Valley State Park, I came upon the giant man tracks about 15 feet from the most prominent brontosaurus track. I photographed these tracks from every angle. The first track measured exactly 21.5 inches in length. From the heel of the first track to the heel of the second track is a stride of exactly 7 feet. The second track also measured 21.5 inches. This one has a very clear toe print. These tracks belong to the Cenozoic era. This area has now been made into Dinosaur Valley State Park, and the tourists have walked over the tracks many hundreds of times, and they have about worn them out. And he goes on to say that photographing these tracks and writing about them is my avocation, not my vocation. I've always thought in order to search for tracks, bones, remains of dinosaurs, one had to go to some faraway places with strange-sounding names. But when I finally discovered these giant men tracks, they were right here at home. Glen Rose, Texas, not too far from our friend Travis Roy, or Giants of Ancient America. If you were paying attention to the news, and this was not a big news story last year, but there was a historic drought in Texas, down where Travis lives, and it dried up a bunch of creek beds. And so what it did was expose a dried up riverbed, and we talked about in Glen Rose, exposing dinosaur tracks, which have been fossilized, into the strata, if we're going to talk like we are PhD doctors. But that's what happened. So it's funny when things, when weather changes, rain, no rain, sometimes these things expose themselves. And as Nate was saying, there is a bigger story behind a lot of this.
That's right.
And you have the book.
Yeah, I have the book. Today we're going back into the bone zone, talking about giant skeletons, giant footprints. Luke's favorite. Surprised you didn't say it, Luke. Luke loves kicking off.
We are now entering the bone zone. 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 The bone zone.
All right, there it is. Officially, Travis, we had to welcome you back into the bone zone.
Dude, this is not our best start to an episode. I feel like someone's a little.
This is the best start. If I can't scuba, what is this all about?
You want to scuba?
Anyway, Travis, welcome back to the podcast. We're like seasoned veterans here. We've been in this space. We've talked ad nauseum on the show about giants, but I just thought it'd be fun to bring you back on because it's a passion of yours. It's a passion of ours. I mean, you're in there daily collecting these articles, and it's probably fun for you to actually get in your car and drive and see some of these tracks. So here's the story, Luke. I got this book, bought it off eBay, showed up to my house, and I'm looking at the map, and I'm like, hey, I text Travis. I'm like, dude, do you live close to Glen Rose? He's like, yeah, I'm like 35 minutes away. I'm like, there's giant tracks in your backyard. Go find them. So there's a map in this book I send it to him, and Travis is like a stud. He literally maps it out on Google Maps and puts the giant tracks on there and sends it back. He's like, I'm going tomorrow. And the next day, Travis is on, boots on the ground, trying to find these giant tracks. So give our listeners an update. Travis, what did you find?
Okay.
We want to hear all about it.
Dude, this was a lot of fun. And I'm really glad you sent me this to preface this. I hadn't heard of the book ever. You know, it was written in 1971. I've been to the state park down there and seen the dinosaur tracks, but I had no clue about the giant tracks, that they were around here. So I jumped in the pickup and I drove down there, made my map, found out the roads I need to go down to get, because some of these weren't in the park, right? If you look at this map. So I hit maybe 3 or 4 different locations on over the last weekend. And to my surprise, I found 3 or 4 tracks that look very, and I would call them humanoid looking, right? You could see the heel, you could see where the toes were, you could see the arch. And I got a really good picture of one, and the thing measures 24 inches long, 11 inches at the right behind the toes. At the heel, it's like 6 inches. So it's pretty large.
Yeah.
Huge, actually.
I think I sent that one. So Luke has that. I have that. I'm looking at it now.
Yeah.
And our listeners,
Yeah.
we're going to post this in our members section. We'll probably post it on our channels too, so you can kind of see it. But yeah, it's pretty deep in the ground. It looks like it's 6
it's
inches
5
or so.
inches.
Okay.
Yeah, I did measure that too.
Again, say how long it was when it was measured.
24.
Okay, I want to just give some perspective here because I'm doing a little Google sleuthing. So we talked a little bit on the top of the show, may or may not have made the cut, but Shaquille O'Neal, size 22. Here's your point of reference, right? It's a huge shoe. We're all kids of the 80s, so when Shaq came out, when we were in junior high in the early 90s, he had this giant shoe. A size 22 shoe is heel to toe, 14 and 11/16 inches.
Wow.
So this is a big footprint. That is a size 22 U.S. shoe. That is what Shaquille O'Neal wears.
14, just a little over 14 inches.
14 and 11/6, so almost 15 inches.
Wow.
So someone just sent us a track that was the same size out of a quarry in Montana.
Okay.
In stone as well, literally the day after you sent us these photos. So it was a 23-inch track. And I think that's what everyone said on our Instagram channels. Luke, they're like, oh, that's just Shaq's foot. No, size 22 doesn't mean 22 inches. And I think a lot of people think that.
Yeah, 15 inches is a size 23 shoe. So just for, this is for your point of reference. I wanted to make that perspective. And the thing that's interesting too about this book, Nate, is if you open it up, Valley of the Giants, right? It's in the 70s. And it begins with photos of the dinosaur tracks alongside of these giant human-looking tracks. And this is 1974. So we're not in the Photoshop or the spoofing age necessarily. This would have been, these are real photos.
I have the original copy.
They're taken by Dr. Dougherty, July 10th, 1971. And it was wet out so you could see it for photographic purposes. You can see by the yardstick, the track he's measuring here is 21.5 inches in length, which again is almost 6 inches bigger than Shaq's foot.
And some of these tracks, Luke, so he documented 4 sets of tracks, and some of them have up to 15 footprints back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But all these other types of dinosaurs along with them, like he's got everything from Tyrannosaurus Rex down. So it wasn't just like one footprint in the dirt. Like, oh, what's so interesting about that? It was 4 sets of multiple tracks. And then, Luke, there's kind of a conspiracy theory as Travis was digging into it. Why don't you get into that part about what you found out about the humanoid tracks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can get into that. Dude, I took a lot of notes.
I love this.
Today.
Love it.
Okay, so that book that we're talking about, Valley of the Giants, was written it was published a year before the state park opened. Just to have that in your mindset. But this guy who wrote that book, he did like 17 years worth of study. He was like a chiropractor, and he moved to Glen Rose for this reason, because he had heard about these tracks. So they were finding these tracks like starting in the 1920s, and they found multiple trackways, and they weren't all just in the park. There's like a lot of miles of this river, and it's all limestone. So I just wanted to put that out there, because this book was written before the park even existed, which if you do some math, I don't know what 17 years before he wrote the book. I don't know when he started writing it, but he published it in, a year before the park opened. So anyway, But the park opened in 1972, and they had like a grand opening. And I was watching this video that the Creation Evidence Museum right here in Glen Rose area, a video that they made, and they have a lot of guys they interviewed on that video. So it's something that people would be interested in watching. We could talk about that later, just for additional information.
So some of these strides, right? Just to give like a little context, some of these strides, if you look in the book, is it a 6 foot? No, it's a 7 foot stride between those 3 tracks at the back. And they're not wearing shoes, right? So you're thinking Shaq's shoe, you got to give an inch in the front, inch in the back, just extra. This is bare feet in the rock. Most of these tracks that he's documented, you can see the toes. Mm-hmm. It's like a monstrous gait here. The stride is massive. Do you think that his findings kind of launched this state park and they had to like cover this up? Do you think that was part of it?
I don't know. Okay, so here's the deal, and let me get into that about the state park. And I want to say this too. Like, I love state parks, right? I'm a guy who gets out and hikes. I love state parks. So this isn't an attack on a state park. And I think this conspiracy here comes from somewhere way above a state park, right? It just trickled down. It's a trickle down effect from like somebody up high says, "Hey, this is the narrative. We're going with evolution now. So we're gonna have to get rid of some stuff." So when this park opened in 1972, this guy, and his name is Jesse Diaz, he went down there with a bunch of his buddies, and they were looking at these dinosaur footprints. And they had a sign that said dinosaur footprints, and it had the name of the dinosaur, and just like an arrow pointing towards, like, I put these signs real close. And even now it says, dinosaur tracks, and it'll kind of point, where the tracks are. So you see them when you're hiking down to the riverbed. But he said real close to that, there was another sign that said, and there were a lot of different, he indicated there were different sizes of man tracks. He did indicate that. But by the biggest of the tracks, they had a sign that said caveman tracks. Huh. And which makes sense. Like, growing up as a kid, I remember, there were cavemen. And so it said caveman tracks. And he remembered, he went down there and he just like started putting his hands in it. And he had never seen or even thought of that people could be that big. So I don't know how old this guy was, but fast forward about 12 years, he said, and he was reading through Genesis, and he got to chapter 6, and he read that there were giants in the earth, or on the earth, in those days. And he said it was almost like something, just like a picture came across his mind. And he just remembered putting his hands in these massive tracks. And he told his wife, he's like, "We've got to go down to the state park. I've seen these tracks before." So he got in. It's like 1984 at this point, and he drives down there, and they go down. He's all excited, and they get down there. He cannot find the tracks anywhere. He looks and looks. So finally, he's probably a little bit irritated at this point, because he's going to go show his wife these tracks that he remembered. He goes to the guard shack. I don't know why I call it the guard shack, like the ranger station. And he goes in there, and he's like, what happened to the caveman tracks that y'all used to have down here? And they just looked at him. They didn't say anything. He said, "What happened to the human caveman tracks that y'all used to have?" And someone spoke up and said, "We never had anything like that here." He said, "Oh, yes, you did. Back in 1972, I saw them with my buddies, and they saw them too." And the guy's like, "No, we never had anything like that here."
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I guess evolution, the theory, started to gain speed maybe in the 70s, is what I learned.
Travis, you've been in this rabbit hole for years, and you can literally read how the higher ups show up on the scene most of the time when these skeletons are found. So this isn't a new thing that you're discovering here. This is just like a familiar theme that when this stuff gets discovered, the Smithsonian or some college or someone shows up, right? And then the familiar thing happens. So speak a little bit to our listeners, because obviously there's a lot of people that haven't listened to the beginning of our podcast. So what you do is new to them.
Yeah. So when a farmer, or a lot of times it was a farmer, or when they were building railways across America, late 1800s, early 1900s, they would be cutting through burial mounds. Or say it's a farmer, he's plowing a field, what he thought was a hill on his field. And some of these mountains aren't huge. They may be 5 feet, or a 5-foot rise. Now in Ohio, you have massive ones, but you'd find guys that were 8 foot or more within these mounds that they would just be plowing up a bone here and there. And so they would contact, it could be a local newspaper or maybe a doctor, somebody. And then from there, a museum would come. Now, a lot of times it was the Smithsonian or the Carnegie Museum or just some, Native American museum would come and get the bones. Sometimes they would display them. There would be many witnesses that saw it. It was a super exciting time for the people in that little community. But after that, after they send them away, you don't really hear about it anymore. Mm-hmm. And you hardly find any follow-up stories about these bones. And so you have to wonder, I guess, whether they're boxing them up somewhere or hopefully not destroying them. But who knows? We don't know that part.
So is that kind of what you think? Is that turning in your mind as you hear this dude's story?
Yeah. Okay. So it did. Yeah. I was thinking they're doing this again, but they're doing it with evidence in stone. Right. So to, continue the story, this guy, he leaves he was at, at the headquarters there. He walks out and then he didn't notice it, but an older gentleman followed him outside and said, "Hey sir, can I talk to you?" He's like, "Sure." He said, "I heard you talking in there to those people." He said, "You see that shed over there in the woods? There's like a little shed over there." He's like, "Those caveman signs are in that shed." He's like, "How do you know?" He's like, "Well," he's like, "I put them there. I used to work here back in that time." He's like, "Well, tell me what happened. Like, what happened to him?" He's like, "Well, we, once the evolutionary theory, started to be pushed," he said, we had to take down those signs and they got rid of the tracks. Wow. So that's why you can't go into the park and find the pictures of the ones in this book, right? You're not going to find that with a perfect toe because that's too obvious. But I thought that was interesting. I had the thought, how could the truth, well, see, I wrote it down, because it was just my initial thought when I read this.
So that was just the signs in the shed. It wasn't they didn't dig anything out.
Yeah, no, they did say that. Now, this was a retired park ranger, and he said he removed the signs and they removed the tracks. So they did both. But he was telling him, "Hey, those signs are still in that shed because I put them there." Mm. But he didn't tell him that in front of everybody who was still, he might have been employed there. I don't know. Or maybe he's just hanging out with them because it's kind of a small town. And then to follow up on an additional story, because some of these tracks were not in the park. So there were some other tracks that in 1989, there were 3 perfect tracks with perfect toes. But in 1989, somebody went in there and with a metal bar and destroyed the tracks, destroyed the toes. So you can't, it just looks you don't know what it is, right? At that point, if the perfect toes are gone. So there was some sort of an agenda, and the lie is so strong that they had to destroy the evidence that was, imprinted in stone.
Mm. Well, as we started at the top of the show, Travis, you talked about how you've compiled more than 1,000 articles, and Nate was saying, there's this familiar theme in a lot of these, that the skeletons, as you was are disappeared, and then now we see the footprints being disappeared, whether it be by a state agency, which of course you would say it answers to the federal government, or whether it be a federal entity, someone like the Smithsonian or state schools, you name it. It's fascinating to me because this is not the 1920s, right? This is not the late 1800s. These are not the majority of the articles that we see are in that range, right? Late 1880s, probably to the 1920s, and then all of a sudden you get into almost 1930 and they start to disappear, and it starts to be they're not in publications anymore. I want to point something out too. I think my first thought with some of this is, how do you know it's Nate? We started out as a Bigfoot show, right? We talk about the big guy on here. How do you know these aren't Bigfoot tracks? I would think would be the first thing, right? Because someone like Dr. Jeff Meldrum or somebody on the show they've got castings of all of these. And so just for fun, I kind of looked up, the most famous Bigfoot footage and what people would say is the best Bigfoot footage. And there's been a lot of evaluation in the last couple of years of the Patterson-Gimlin film. But Roger Patterson himself actually casted a cast from that experience with Patty. And the length of that cast was 18 inches. So still 3 inches longer than Shaq's size 22, but not anywhere really near that giant track that we have documented, photographed, and in this book from the 1970s.
And Sasquatch feet are different too. They're, from what I've seen, they're kind of a thicker, and they've got more of a break in the middle.
It looks a lot less human. Yeah, it doesn't look very. It's much wider too. And so when you look at these photos, and if you're a member of the show, good plug to be a member of the show, you would want to take a look at what we're going to post in the back end with these photos. And Travis compiled a lot of good data, but take a look at the footprints here, because they would look very, very, you'd say, humanoid. Did you have that thought, or was there any of that at first to be like, this could be like a Bigfoot track?
That did cross my mind. What my initial thought was, why do they not have shoes on? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Let's just say, go back to the Old Testament. I kind of feel like, though we don't really have a lot of proof. I mean, they were riding chariots back then. Did they not have shoes, like sandals or something? Like when Goliath came out and met David, he had bronze. And so, that's a great question, Luke. Obviously I don't know, but that did cross my mind. But to Nate's point, yeah, some of the feet on the Squatch prints are, different, more of that, a very high arch. But
my other question is how much do you think, this is just your opinion, right? Because we can only postulate about this, but how much do you think it was that the footprints were giant, that they were removed, or how much do you think that it was they're in the same strata as dinosaur? I mean, those are two very, very big problems for a certain worldview and point of view, right? You have footprints that seem very human, that are way too big, and they actually sit right next to dinosaur tracks, of which the two were never supposed to be coexist, right? In humans, even though this is a giant, quote, giant human, they're supposed to exist in the same time period, and yet the photographs in this book are side by side. So you have this unbelievable evidence of fossilized tracks that should be, according to that timeline of that theory in that narrative, hundreds of millions of years apart.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they're just way too big, right? You're not having you don't have a Luke 14 there, or even a Shaq 22. You got Air Giants. They're 24.
Yeah,
24
yeah.
inches.
What size is that?
Yeah.
We don't even know.
Yeah,
yeah.
The Air Goliath. Yeah, it's a big fella.
Dude, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's 50-50 on that. Like, I think both of them are putting a lot of hardcore pressure on mainstream narrative.
Yes, and right. It's got to be.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, it would have to be. There is a track, and I'm sure you are well aware of this, but it's in the museum. In the Creation Evidence Museum. It's the real track. It's the one where you have a human track. I think it's 11.5 inches long, barefoot. And you had like the three-toed dinosaur actually stepped on top of the human track, which just kind of blows their narrative out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure they highly hate that track.
So in this book, he documents here. I want to read this little section here. He says, I have counted 40 man tracks at group 2. So he had 4 different groups that he had outlined. And there are more than 100 dinosaur tracks on the same level of rock in the riverbed at spot number 2. I've spent 10 years searching the Paluxy River for giant man tracks, together with dinosaur tracks. I have counted more than 50 man tracks and more than 100 dinosaur tracks in the same layer of rock. The same layer of rock. And he said, this proves that man did not evolve from anything, but was rather created by God. And a lot of these guys, these older guys, are just kind of coming around to some of the giant narrative, because we live in the age of information, right? You can go back and you can dig through these archives of newspapers. Some of these guys just thought that, Adam was a big guy. He was a taller guy. He was a 12-footer. Maybe he was. Who knows? But Luke and I did another episode on Rockwall, Texas, which is only 100 miles away, sort of northeast of this area. So we know they were not only were there giants in Texas, but they were building these, some people say that they found megalithic pre-flood construction down in Texas with some of these. I mean, the town's called Rockwall. We did a whole episode on it.
Yeah, there's a pretty compelling argument that it could be megalithic. And the Scott Walters and the America on Earth and History Channels will tell you that it's natural. It could be natural, right? I mean, we talked to Tim Alberino about the Montana megaliths, and he went and visited them, and he believes they are natural. So you could have that, but I think this sort of stacks. Some of the stuff stacks up, and you go, this seems a little more plausible based upon what we're finding, in the strata. I think it's fascinating. The photos in this book, and we'll post these on the back end, are dinosaur tracks next to giant human footprints, and they are right next to each other. And
it's wild. It's wild.
Yeah. There's a lot going on here. You got a lot of schools of thought, but I do think you're right. It busts a hole in the narrative, right? So they have to get rid of some guy out at night. Take your steel pole and go destroy all these man tracks. Since it sounds like there's only like 50 tracks total that are like obvious, which is just. It's sort of like a crime against humanity to destroy history like that,
Oh, yes.
You've got, and I know it's like nerds like us that are interested in this because this is kind of what we do. This is our channel. This is what we podcast about. And I like the Bigfoot idea, Luke, just to get that out of the way. We're talking another 8-9 inches on some of these tracks, bigger than even Bigfoot. So. Some big fellas down there. There's a lot of blurry stuff in Texas, and we should talk a little bit about how long it takes. So in the book, he talks about they found some tools that were fossilized, and that it doesn't take as long as the average person thinks to have a fossilized track. Luke and I have posted numerous tracks over the years that look like just a big human print in stone. And not only are we taught that things are billions of years old, but that it takes a long time for things to turn to stone, and it just doesn't. You can look into it. There's a lot of people that have blown holes into that theory that things can fossilize in years. Not very long.
Right.
A few years, you can have something that was once an organic matter turned into stone. It's not. So people go, well, how do these tracks get preserved? Why did they wash away? What happened?
Well, I mean, a lot of these tracks, there was a massive flood in like 1908 that it was like the river rose 27 feet. And at that time, this was like one of the only rivers that wasn't dammed up in Texas yet. And so they were saying they were like boulders like the size of Volkswagen Beetles just floating, like just tumbling down this river. And what it did is broke away the riverbed and revealed another layer, and that's where a lot of the tracks were. And so I did, in looking into all this, there is something now that can still, it's something called a carbonic acid that it can, with the seasons changing back and forth, it can actually sort of eat away at this limestone riverbed. So over time, it can kind of wear out these tracks slightly, but I was just down there the other day, and the dinosaur tracks still look pretty awesome. So,
how many different types of dinosaur tracks did you see?
I think there's at least 2 or 3 there, dude. It was hot. It was hot that day. And so this, like you mentioned, he said there was a lot of tracks at track site 2. I've got to go back. I've got to go back there because I couldn't make it to that. It says
there's 40 human tracks there.
Dude, I'm going then. I'm going.
Is that outside the park? Or is that still?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a shot. There's a shot then that things can still be there. Yeah.
I'm going, man. I'm going to go there.
Blurry correspondent on the ground, Travis Roy.
Literally on the ground.
On the ground.
Dude,
so I love it. This book, he kind of goes into he talks about there's cave paintings of dinosaurs. He talks about the Nephilim a little bit. You had these early blurry guys. This is the podcast of the 70s right here. This is like homemade book.
It's called a book. Yeah.
But this is how people like learned in the 70s. They picked up these things called books. They had pictures in them and they read them. What is that all about? Anyway.
No, I think what's interesting too is that if you look in some of the stuff in this book, Travis, some of these are visible only when the river is very low and dry too, and at some of these sites as well. So there's probably a good shot that some of these things still exist and are still out there because most of the time they're covered by water. So I'm hoping that we can get an update from you at some point, especially with droughts going on. I don't know if it's still, you guys still in the midst of a drought down there?
Yeah. So the river's not flowing, but to your point, one of these group sites, where the track sites, I went there first, and of course, it had like, 5 inches of water all right there.
Right.
And with a layer of like 1.5 inches of soot and mud on top of that, so those tracks probably are still there. I may have to go out there and like my swim trunks and just on my hands and knees and just feel around.
Dude,
right.
Get your scuba mask out or your snorkel gear.
Put my face down in that,
that
6
cesspool.
6 inches. Yeah.
Come back. So Travis has giardia, but he did find out that the tracks are there. Hey, I had a question. This is going to be a bit of an aside, but this is something I wanted to run by you because you're in the business of digging through the microfiche and through the old stuff to find these articles and evidence of giants being discovered, right? And one of the things that comes up, and this came up actually because there was one in Franklin, Tennessee that was found here, is that all these are just mistaken identity for mastodons, right? Mastodon skeletons that people are just reassembling to look very human. That's something that people will say, and that or it's a giant sloth. That's what you get if you get into the areas in the equatorial spaces, right? It's a giant sloth, or it used to be tropical here, and so that's what it is. What are your thoughts on sort of those explanations when it comes to contextualizing some of these finds?
Yeah. Okay. So every once in a while I do, and I don't usually post these, but out of all of these articles that I've discovered, maybe 10 or less, you'll have somebody who is against this. And it might be closer, if I were to go back and find them again, it may be closer to the 1930s. And they will say, yeah, that's just a bunch of lies. That's a bunch of lies. It was really this. But those are few and far between. So a lot of times with these reports, except for the one in Franklin, Tennessee, it was like a really big guy. I think he was like 19 feet.
It was way down.
He's quite a ways down,
right.
And it looked like he had been like buried alive, sort of. Right, that's what I kind of got the feeling of. But a lot of these in the burial mounds, you may have a guy who's 9 foot tall, 10 foot tall, but they have weapons with them. A lot of times, they have really cool artifacts like copper beads,
and they're buried with normal sized humans as well, right? So you have this in a lot of ways. You have that quarter you place on the ground next to the footprint for scale, right? You've got a regular sized human. That's a tough one to pull. Like, I think tools is a great point. Like, you aren't burying a mastodon with tools ceremoniously with humans, or a giant sloth, or whatever the explanation is for some of these giant skeletons. I was thinking about it. I've been wanting to talk to you because that's what comes back, right? I think we've alluded to a few of these, and we published a few as well too. And we were active doing some blogging stuff on the website with some of these discoveries, and people nowadays are just like, oh, they just misidentified mastodons. Oh, it's just they didn't know what they were doing. Yeah. And it's like, well, some of these things went on display at like drugstores, and these were not.
I mean, they're skulls.
Yeah.
Some of their skulls.
Yeah.
Like, a human skull the size of a bucket, or wood bucket, or they would call it a peck bucket or something like that, because that was like what they were used to, the terms they were used to back then.
Right.
I don't think a mastodon skull looks anywhere remotely close to a human skull, even though it's like an extra large human skull.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Like.
Yeah, I find that interesting, right? There's always. That's why I honestly wanted to bring up the Sasquatch thing, right? Because that, for some people, might feel more comfortable. But then you look at the photos, and it's hard. This is very, very tough to refute. This is not 1880s journalism or 1920s. People can say all they want and talk about yellow journalism and these things they try to throw at a lot of these articles, right? But the paradigm is still there. And this is where we always go back to Nate on the show, is that like, so Travis has compiled 1,000. Guess what? If one of those is true, man, that busts the paradigm. You've got to figure out how that works. And the reality is there's a lot more than one that are more than likely true, right? And so I just think it's fascinating here because we are decades after that. We're into more of what we consider to be a more modern era. We're post World War II. We are post Vietnam even here, right? So we're post Woodstock. You want your cultural markers, and we've got photographs, right, with things for scale. He's got signs and yardsticks, and these are big human footprints, and I'm excited to see the stuff that you're able to document as well, because I think this is This is so cool.
This is the juice that I needed. I'm glad.
This is the juice, baby. Yeah, that's right.
So I think there's another point to talk about, Luke, is that some people might say, well, what these could be, some other type of animal tracks. But in this book, he's documenting even brontosaurus tracks and T-Rex tracks. And the T-Rex track that he did document is 4 foot wide across each way. So we're talking some big animals are cruising through Texas. Everything's just bigger in Texas, including you got giants and all kinds of, and I know a lot of people on our channels, Travis, we can talk a little bit about, think that dinosaur is just a rebranded, name for dragons. So they were dragons in the ancient world, and now they're called dinosaurs. And they say, even in this book, he says, the theory of evolution was a theory when he was a kid. And by the 70s, it was becoming fact. So it was already transitioning to a fact in the 70s. It wasn't like, he said when he grew up, it was they used it as a theory. But in the course of his life, it became fact. And I think most people who are skeptical and listen to our show or don't like to, sort of read the Christian paradigm into their worldview, we've all been indoctrinated by that propaganda, right? To some extent.
Yeah, right.
It still creeps into the church. People still have a hard time. People are trying to try to explain these two things as they could kind of flow together. But the more we kind of uncover on our show, you can't really do that because there is an alternate history that we've all discovered that is sort of inconvenient if you're trying to fully embrace this scientific narrative that's been pumped into our heads for the last 60 years.
Yeah, it's crazy. No, there is an element of people who, they're Christian, but they still want to they still think that somehow evolution or, even the timestamp periods
can coexist.
Yeah. But it just doesn't, from what I can tell.
So how many giant tracks do you think you found?
Dude, some of these I didn't see till I was looking at my pictures and footage later. So I was like, okay, I've got to go back to this one spot. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I did find one that was like, I thought it was little, man. It was like 14 inches. But now we've been talking about Shaquille. It's like, well, maybe it wasn't little. But yeah, it's 14 inches. And I thought, well, because it was small compared to this 24-inch.
It's kind of crazy what you can still find these days, right? Like we're still getting this stuff sent to us. And
dude, if you sit at home, you're not going to find anything. But if you get out and start poking around, that's the only time you're going to find stuff. I mean, I know it's kind of obvious, but a point to make. But I had that thought. It's like, well, that was kind of cool. I got out there and I kind of stirred up some evidence.
Yeah. And then in the book, the guy gets like postcards and other pictures from other people who kind of have found similar things. Like there's a track from a big giant track from Kansas in the book. People send this guy their findings. And that's what I love about the podcast is people send us their stuff. And the bigger we get, the more people are like, hey, my friend's a stonemason. We found this giant track in Montana. Like if we didn't do this show, it would have been lost. There would have been no.
Yeah. It wouldn't have gone anywhere really. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And
no one would ever hear of it.
We made a reel about it. And I love that guys like you that are boots on the ground, trying to preserve this history, trying to dig it up, because there's going to be a time, we've talked about it, you're working on a book to compile all this stuff, but it's gonna go MIA at some point. I mean, if they can take a metal pole out in the middle of the night and destroy all these tracks, what else are they going to do digitally in the future? They're going to destroy all the evidence that there were giants in America. They're gonna remove everything.
Yeah, I had this thought the other day, and I think I mentioned it to you. As hard as they try to destroy evidence, God always has something that's preserved somewhere. You know what I mean? Like they're going to try so hard, but if God wants something to get out, it will get out.
Yeah,
there's going to be
like the jars of clay, man. Just like this,
right?
These pots in a cave somewhere.
Rain on my face. Oh, that jars of clay, not that jars of clay.
Exactly. Luke's about to break into on the song here. Travis, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready.
He's going to put on a show,
clay, man. Who didn't love some of that OG jars of clay back in the day?
Yeah. No, I think you're right, Travis. I think that it reminds me of some of those words that God uses the foolish things to confound the wise. It's just like this old footprint in a stone or this pot in a cave totally just throws a wrench in this whole narrative. It doesn't take a whole lot to expose these mountains of lies that they've erected in our in our colleges, our institutions, and I think more people are waking up to the fact that like, I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
Yeah. Lies can only stand for so long.
Right.
Just a little bit of truth will just break it down.
I would say this too, like guys, that if you have a hypothesis and it requires you to remove and throw out evidence, you no longer have a theory, you have a narrative, and your hypothesis should be able to be proved, working forwards and working backwards, right? Mostly working forwards. That's the idea. So it's fascinating, and I'm excited to see what you're able to find when you get back out there, because as our friend Tim Alberino would say, this is a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the most interesting things about this story, Travis, to me, when I was thinking about this, is you've been doing this for years. You were doing this long before Blurry Creatures came around. And usually you can find a footprint somewhere, like a single print. You literally have probably the best preserved giant tracks in the world right where you are. You find that kind of interesting?
That we know of, right? Yeah.
I do find that. Yeah, that is.
Unless it's in some cave somewhere that we don't know, right? But
yeah, I mean, I've heard that there are some in Colorado, Oklahoma, but I think it has to be the perfect riverbed. I mean, it can't be sandstone. Well, I guess it could be, but a lot of our rivers up north are mud or like pebbles. Well, just south of the Metroplex here, they're all limestone. And there's a lot of rivers and creek beds. Man, they run hundreds and hundreds of miles. And I guarantee a lot of those, it's illegal just to jump into as long as there's a road access, to jump right into a river if it's 40 foot or wider. And so, dude, I've got miles to walk.
Yeah, you do.
And
count those steps, baby.
Right.
Count those steps.
That's right. Yeah.
No,
sweat it out.
I also think it's interesting, like, when you're talking about the amount of evidence, like that the conditions have to be almost perfect for these things to fossilize in general. So you have to have, dinosaur tracks, giant tracks, whatever it is, it takes the very right amount of weather, material, sediment, and then set of circumstances for these things to actually turn into fossils, into stone. So, that makes it even more rare, right? Like, because you're not just talking about, let's just find giant footprints from, how 10,000 plus, whatever it is, whatever the timeline is years ago. We're talking about finding ones that happened to be in the right conditions at the right time, stepped in mud or stepped in the right material, and it fossilized because of, I would hypothesize, because of the cataclysm, but that isn't always the case either. And so it's just interesting. What a gem that it's right there in your backyard.
That's what the author of the book says. He says, I thought he was going to have to travel the world to actually research paleontology, but actually in my backyard was some of the best preserved stuff. Some of these tracks, he has a picture of a brontosaurus tracks, and it can hold 21 gallons of water. Just this one track. So, I think he was more interested in the dinosaur tracks, and he says he was talking to some old timers, and the old timers were telling him, it says right here, 7 years ago when I moved to Glen Rose, Texas, I began hearing tales of giant tracks. The giant animals called dinosaurs. I heard tales like, way back when I was a boy, I saw these giant men tracks in the bedrock in the Paluxy River. And I would ask, how large are these man tracks? The old timers would measure off about 18 to 24 inches with their hands. And then I would ask, where are those tracks? I want to see them. And the best answer I could get was, up a river a ways. So you had these people that kind of had these, like, there's rumblings and rumors of these tracks existed for a long time. And this is the 70s, so I'm guessing he's talking to some guys maybe in their 80s, 70s, and 80s at that point. So when they were kids, they'd probably run up the river and say, hey, there's dinosaur tracks and there's giant men tracks. And, it wasn't a conspiracy theory back then. It wasn't some fringe podcast that had to break the news, right? But he's kind of saying the same thing that I thought about you, Travis. Like you're doing these years of documenting giants, and then here they are in your backyard, which is cool.
Yeah, that is awesome. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable is right.
And the best thing about Travis is I'll be talking to Travis about giants, and then he'll just drop in, yeah, Bigfoot was in my backyard last night talking to me. And I'm like, what? You sound like Roger right now, Travis.
Oh, jeez.
He's out there playing the flute.
Yeah.
Yeah, give us a little update on the squatches that live in your backyard.
Oh, geez. Well, I mean, I go on a lot of hikes, so and sometimes I go like at night, and so dude, I have a lot of stories about those guys. So, like, where do you want me to start? Like,
Texas is blurry.
It is. Yeah, man. No, I've been on hikes where I've heard conversations like in the woods. Like it sounded like a massive dude. And there was actually what it caught my ear was like, it sounded like brush was being moved around. I was like, well, what's going on back there? Like it was like further. I was up on a small mountain ridge and it was even further deep into the woods there. And I was already aware of them possibly being there because I'd heard them like smacking, trees and stuff back in there. But, I was able to hear like a conversation. It just lasted for maybe a couple minutes. It's kind of faint because it was through the trees, but if it makes sense, you could tell whatever was making the noise was very big. So it sounded like a male, a female, maybe a couple kids. So
it wasn't like muffled. You spent a lot of time in the woods, so just to spell, it wasn't muffled human voices like down over the hill or the canyon.
No, because as I went closer to the river, you could hear that's where people were.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, if there are people fishing, I try to avoid them, and I just end up crawling up this mountain and just walking along and through these cedar trees.
You're a purist, bro.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I try to blend in, but I got to hear this. And it's pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Was it like the Ron Moorhead, like the samurai chatter, or was it different than that?
Yeah, it sounded like the male's voice was like metallic sounding. It was so deep. It wasn't fast chatter. It was more of the slower stuff you hear on the Ron Moorhead, like where it's like it sounded like actual words.
You thought about doing it for a second. You did. You thought about it. You're like, I'll do my best impression.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be hearing this.
Yeah. You're like,
it does sound jarring.
It's the big guy talking to his wife. You're like, man, I feel like I'm really intruding on their privacy here.
Honestly, do you want to know the feeling I got? What I got out of it, I felt like the dude was getting onto the kids. Like that's what it sounded like. And then the mom was like confirming agreeing with what he said. That's what it sounded like. Because I heard a woman. Yeah, dude, it was weird.
I love it.
But I was somewhere at night, pretty close, and I could tell, they come through this area, and I was out just to tell you what I was doing. I could hear something rustling leaves like constantly. And that's something I've noticed that they will do. It's like a constant distraction is all I can think of. But I started banging on some metal and I was kind of being an irritant, I'm sure. I was just banging on the metal. And after a while, I actually got a vocal from this, whatever was back there moving leaves around, actually made a vocal with his mouth, with his throat. And I'm probably 60 yards from this. But I can't see it, but it's because it's in the woods. But dude, my heart like jumped into my throat. It felt like, but it was just like like I can't even mimic it really.
Yeah.
He did it four times in a row. I was like, oh, okay. I don't know what that means because I've been around this group for a long time, like years. Not sure what this means. I guess it's okay.
They're used to you.
I guess they're used to me, but
that's the word on the street is they can live around humans, but they take a long time to get familiarized with the people that are around their area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's trust. I think it's like trust, right? You have to have their trust, and even if you have their trust, they're still pretty skeptical of you. Like they're not sure of you.
Unless you're Roger, then they come in and they braid your horse's hair.
Well, they were watching Roger a long time, probably.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They just knew Roger was he was a good guy.
That's it. That's it.
He was a good old guy.
They liked him.
He's out there just playing the flute for him. He's like, these are my pals.
They saw him out there manicuring the snake mound.
You're right, dude. Just fighting off boar crocs. I mean,
that's right. That's right.
They're on the same team.
They're like, he keeps planting those tomatoes and we keep eating them. What a nice guy.
What a guy.
Yeah.
No, but I love it. I love that you like, Travis, to me, you're looking, you're out there looking, you're looking for things that are glossed over in history. You're looking for small voice in the woods. You're looking for that track in the ground. You're looking for things, and you trained your eye to see what a lot of people don't see. And you got the blurry vision going.
That's right. That's right. You do have to blur your eyes a little bit when you're looking. You gotta squint a little bit.
Yeah. To know what's out there. And just for our listeners, you back up, you're in Texas, you kind of have some acreage behind you. So you kind of have nature in your backyard. You're always out hiking.
Yeah.
Every time I call you, it seems like you're out on some sort of hike or an adventure. You're posting photos. You get out. It seems like your way of de-stressing, when you could say.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's therapeutic to get out there and just, that's what I think. Just get out there and get away from the city. Yeah. Get out in the forest, to get on the riverbank. That's where those guys are hanging out anyway. Obviously, the giants back in the day were hanging out around there too.
Yeah, just walk on the riverbeds, just yelling at their kids.
Probably so.
Nothing's changed.
Just universal truths, right? Yeah, kids doing bad things. Little Bigfoot just out there.
Yeah,
just sticking their fingers in light sockets.
Your mom just washed your feet. She's gonna kill you. How dare you get muddy again? Well, Travis. Maybe my last question, wrap it up here. You've been cataloging giant stuff the last 3 years since we've talked to you. Can you give us an update? Do you have did you find anything in the last 3 years that sticks out in your mind? A couple wild stories. You have anything you found in the catalogs that you can remember?
Oh man.
Any weird ones? Because we got into them. We got into it last time. So go back. If you haven't listened to our first episode with Travis, I think we broke down about 10 or 12, your top 10. We did sort of a late night with David Letterman.
Yeah. No, I mean, dude, I don't know, man. There's so many of them. They, like, in my mind, they just kind of run together. And so I can say this, like, what I've learned about these giants, a few things. A lot of times they seem to have a religion where they worship the sun. Like, they were either their heads or their feet were buried facing east many times. That's something that I've learned. They had a lot of copper with them. They sometimes they had stone battle axes with them. Some of my favorite ones are like articles where there were 12. There was an article where there were 12. There was more than that. There were 12 foot tall. I think there were like 10 or more giants just found buried along a river in like Louisiana, but they're all 12 foot tall. It's stories like that are like, they're compelling to the truth that they were actually a race of people, not just like somebody who had gigantism. It's stories like that I love to find. But yeah, I'd say just get on the site that I have on giants underscore ancient America on Instagram and Facebook, and just start flipping through them.
Yeah. You didn't find a cave full of little people, skeletons, just like 50 little people.
You can dream, Nate. You can dream.
It's going to happen.
It's been a while.
The race of pygmies.
Hey, maybe I need to start researching that. We'll see what I come up with.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Once you exhaust the big guy track,
yeah,
then you go for the just the spectrum swings all the way back to the little guys.
It does, yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think that's good. Like when you find batches of them, because a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, they just found one person with gigantism." There's people that are 8 foot tall today. Yeah, there are 1 in a million people.
You're right.
Get that big, but we're talking. You're finding dozens sometimes.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like today when there are genetics, and you can see it in family lines where everybody in that family is big. They're 6'5", 7, 6'4", 6'2". And they all kind of look, you can see the bloodline, but we're talking like, let's bump it up a few notches. And you're talking guys they're all 12 foot or 10 foot. The women are 8 foot. And you did have that. You had women that were 7 to 8 foot tall, buried with some of these giant males. And so, yeah, it's picture what you have today, but like bump it up, 10 notches. Your bones, the bones are, your skulls that they find are an inch thick, 1.5 inches thick. Horses' size teeth. So yeah, it's not like a problem. I guess it is a problem, but it's a problem that originated in Genesis 6, not one from gigantism disease or anything like that.
Do you think they couldn't breed? Sort of, they were degrading over time, and eventually they just couldn't reproduce anymore because they just kind of disappeared.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, there are so many legends, from Indian legends and Native American legends.
Exactly, they were still around.
Yeah, later. They were around, and I think it's like down where the Aztecs were from. They have legends. For like some of the Aztecs had legends of the pre-giants or the pre-Aztec people were judged by God. They said like fire. So who knows like really what happened? You know, there's speculation there, and you have to take it from the old timers amongst their communities. But I don't really know. I mean, that's a good question. Did they get burnt out? Like burnt to death like they did in the Lovelock Cave, you know, yellow hair getting attacked by, you know, just getting ganged up on by a bunch of other people. Did they go into hiding? I don't know. Were there further judgments from the Lord that we're not aware of yet upon them?
Yeah, they didn't have they didn't have the blessing to be here, really, you know?
No. So we know in the Bible there are many, well, I'll say many. There was the initial flood, right? And then they came back. And then you had Joshua and his great battle against them, and which took them down quite a few notches. And that was a judgment of the hailstone, the sun standing still. So are there other judgments from the Lord that maybe still need to be discovered? Who knows?
Exactly. I love it. I love your thoughts. How's the book going?
Oh,
tell our listeners
going,
where
man.
you're at. Where you at? We're gonna light a fire under you here.
Okay. Yeah. Dude, I'm still plugging away on the book. Like all my writing is done. Now I'm just like, I'm plugging in the newspaper articles. That takes a lot of time. So like, you know, every 5 articles, it takes about an hour.
Jeez.
So, and you get kind of burnt out after an hour. It's like, okay, I need to do something else for a second. Cause I'm rereading each article, and then I go ahead and type out some of what it's saying just in case people don't want to read the article or it's too blurry. So that's a lot of work. It's coming along.
Very blurry.
So blurry.
Yeah.
Well, tell our listeners again where they can follow your work and harass you for a change.
Okay.
And not us.
Yeah. Okay.
No, they harass you enough. I already know.
Yeah. That's all right. I don't mind it. I mean, I enjoy answering questions if I know the answer. But anyhow, you can find me on Instagram, and it's Giants of Ancient America. So Ancient America is one word on Instagram, and same name on Facebook.
I love it. Travis, we've been talking since episode 1 with you, and become a good friend. And I love that about Blurry Creatures, is that the people who come on our show, it's more than just trying to get content out there. I feel like we've developed a relationship with almost all of our guests, and I just really appreciate your hustle and spirit and willingness to come on our show in the beginning. I remember I kind of had to talk you into it. You're like, I don't know, I don't really want to come on a podcast, but you did. And
dude, yeah. Back then, I was like, I'd only been on like a radio show that broadcast out of like Denton, Texas, like north of DFW. That's like all I had done.
Yeah.
Oh, dude.
It was ham radio.
Yeah.
You were just talking to truckers, and they probably liked it. They probably really loved it. Yeah.
Oh, they were eating it up.
I know.
Like, where can we get more of this?
You're like, what's your call sign, big rider?
Yesterday we just did an interview for our first magazine, and she's like, remember magazines with like paper, and you have articles and it sits on your coffee table? And Luke and I are like, I think so. I think we remember that.
Yeah. They used to keep them by payphones. I remember those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Bringing it back. So you got a book in the works. Go follow Travis on Instagram. We just appreciate you, man. Thanks for being a friend in this weird blurry space. We all get a lot of pushback in this space from a lot of different types of people who, when you're trying to push the truth out there, it seems like you get these attacks that just kind of burrow into your mind, and it takes a community of people to kind of like, hey, just keep going, keep plugging away. Don't let the few people get you down. There's so many people out there that love your information. I know it's hard sometimes. You're just posting news articles, but it's important that this history gets preserved, because like you said in this episode, it just takes a couple guys to go out and pull the plug or destroy the evidence, and we have a lot of cases of that. Someday some kid, someday this could be like you, Travis. Someday some guy buys your book off eBay and on some futuristic podcast 40 years from now, I'm like, this guy Travis documented all these ancient newspapers of giants being found, and who knows what 100 years from now some guys could be talking about your book on their weird podcast episode or whatever it is in the future. So
Yeah, I love it. That's why we got to do stuff like
That's
this.
That's why it's important work.
Yep.
It's cool to find these old timers. The getting blurry back in the 70s.
Dude, I love it.
I appreciate it. We'll post some of these photos. Luke and I will post them in our members chats. We'll try to post them on our social media channels. Thanks again, Travis, for coming on Blurry Creatures. Be nice to Bigfoot out there.
Okay,
we don't want you disappearing on us.
I'll be well behaved.
He likes you. Maybe he's protecting you by now.
Oh man.
I hope so.
Who knows?
I hope so. I need it. All
right, Travis.
Jeez.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Travis.
it. Later.